record the whole. There we go.
Okay, so yeah, good evening, everyone. I'm going to give us a bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the more common plants that you might encounter at the moment. I think most of the plants that I'll show you are things which will be in flower. There might be one or two that have gone over, and there might be a few that are yet to come into flower, but I've tried to pick plants which I think are around at the moment, so you may be able to go out and have a look for those. So I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully we will all be able to see a slide with introduction to wildflowers and their identification. Oh, go back to that. There we go. So hopefully everyone can see that. The plant that you are looking at there is a type of buttercup, which is a globe flower, and they're quite rare. Grow up in the White Peak part of the Derbyshire Peak District, so they grow on limestone, usually north-facing slopes. So most plants will have their particular ecological niche that they occupy. So there'll be soils and geology and climate are all play a key role, as well as the overall kind of habitat that a plant occurs in. And the globe flower is quite localized. It prefers these sort of north-facing slopes that are often quite steep. So that's what this one's growing up near Buxton. So just in terms of some of the equipment, you don't need a lot of equipment really to go out and enjoy flowers, but there are a few books that are available. I've just picked out 3 here, one of which is the Francis Rose Wildflower Key. It's the book that I tend to use, which I've always used it really, and I guess I'm quite attached to it in that respect. So I've kind of bought numerous copies over the years. It's got good descriptions of the plants. It has got keys. You don't have to use the keys, but they are there. So for the more difficult groups, the wildflower keys are actually really useful. Things like Speedwell's, for example, and St John's worts. There are nice short keys that you can kind of deal with in a sort of bite-sized way. So the Francis Rose key, I think, is good. The taxonomy in it is maybe a little bit out of date, but wouldn't worry about that too much. And then there's the Collins Guide, which is also pretty good. It's a little bit, it's probably a little bit more comprehensive, but a bit heavier. So obviously that's something to think about. There are shorter guides. Sometimes there might be a guide to flowers of particular habitats, and that can be a useful way to start looking at wildflowers. And anything which I guess you can fit in your pocket is sometimes preferable when you're starting out. But those 2 guides are pretty good. A ×10 lens, that's always useful, and being able to measure the size of the plant or parts of the plant can also be quite good. Camera, taking photographs of plants and identifying them afterwards is always available. You can do that, and it's quite helpful. And then there's another small guide, a pocket guide to wildflower families down there, which I think is also quite a good thing to try and do. And the talk this evening is kind of laid out with wildflower families, so that's a good way to try to train yourself to learn how to identify plants. So just a quick overview of the parts of a flower. So we've got petals. So most of the flowers that we look at will have petals. Occasionally those petals are replaced by sepals or tepals, but most of the time it is a genuine petal. And then you've got the style in the center, which leads down into the ovary with the ovules in it, and that sits on the receptacle, which then is on the flower stem. And at the top of the style is a stigma, and then round the sides, you'll usually have a certain number of anthers. So there's a filament, the green bit here, and then the anther at the top. And collectively, that's the stamen, which is the male part, the reproductive part of the plant. So the number of stamens actually varies quite a lot. And that's one of those features that you need the times 10 lens to look for. So you might be looking for 10 or 5 or 4, however many it is. And it does vary. Sometimes within a family, it will say there are 10 stamens. And occasionally it can vary within a family. So some of these features are fixed and some of them are a little bit more fluid. And then the whole flower together is the carpel. So that's just something to sort of bear in mind. Oh, and there's a small picture down here which just shows a stipule, because that gets mentioned a couple of times. So the stipule is this kind of green leafy structure, which is at the kind of axis or the sort of node just below the leaf. So it kind of sits down at this intersection. Some plants have it, some don't. So one of the first families that you encounter in a lot of these books is the buttercup family, the Ranunculacea, and a couple of species which are around, well, at the moment, you could easily see 4, 5, 6 different types of buttercup. The bulbous buttercup, which you can see down here, now that I should have moved that. Ooh, look at that. I've done a silly thing here because I've moved a couple of pictures around. So that arrow should be pointing to these little sepals which are downturned. In the buttercups, this is bulbous buttercup, sepals are downturned, and this is the creeping buttercup, and the sepals are flush against the base of the petals. Meadow buttercup is the same. So creeping and meadow buttercup, quite similar flowers, but with bulbous, you should be able to spot these downturned sepals very easily. This one flowers probably a little bit earlier, but they're all in flower at the moment. Bulbous buttercup does also have a little bulb. If you were to dig it up, you would find a bulb that it's growing from. Not a huge thing, but it is noticeably there. Whereas creeping buttercup has a very creeping habit, so it will be kind of almost leaves that are prostrate across the ground and creeping along the ground, and it prefers damper habitats. Bulbous buttercup tends to prefer drier habitats. The differences between meadow buttercup and creeping buttercup are a little bit more difficult, but the leaves are more finely divided with meadow buttercup. It's less creeping in habit. And the stem that just below the flower, creeping buttercup is slightly grooved, and meadow buttercups tends to be smooth. But that's not always. It's not always the best feature. It can be useful, but sometimes it seems to be a little bit ambiguous, that feature. So it's mainly the leaves on meadow and creeping buttercup. If you're in ancient woodland or ancient hedgerows as well, sort of looking, particularly where it's a bit damp and the ground's a bit wet and flushed, so it might be a stream present as well. Goldilocks buttercup, which is it's a beautiful plant, but the petals don't last long. So you tend to find these kind of straggly plant with very divided leaves, far more divided than the creeping buttercup or meadow buttercup. And it grows in a slightly untidy fashion with these, say, all these finely divided leaves, and then the petals often fall off. So here, this one's only got 2 petals left, and I think that one's got 4 maybe. That one's got 4, so one of them's fallen off. It's just a characteristic of this particular species. There is another one called celery-leaved buttercup, which grows in sort of grazing marshes and places like that. And that one, the petals are often not present at all, or much reduced. So it is a characteristic of some buttercups. But this is Goldilocks buttercup, damp old woodlands, probably the sort of west of Derbyshire and into the Peak District. but it does grow elsewhere across the county. And common water crowfoot is also in the buttercup family. The crowfoots grow in still water and flowing water. This is common water crowfoot, white flowers. You might see it covering the surface of a pond. If you're looking at a river, so the River Derwent or the River Wye, you might see these small white flowers in the on the surface of the water. That will either be river water crowfoot or stream water crowfoot. There's two species. You can see both of them in Derbyshire. They're a little bit tricky to tell apart, and you need to get samples, which is sometimes difficult if it's deeper water. But you might well see that. I think you can see one of those species in Bakewell on the River Wye. Whereas these other species like this one, Ranunculus aquatilus, prefer still water. So there's a bit of a difference there, and some of them grow on mud and that kind of thing. But it's the white flower that you're looking for. So it's a buttercup, but it's got these white flowers. Saxifrage. The most likely saxifrage that you're going to see at the moment is meadow saxifrage, which is growing in damper grasslands and pastures across many parts of Derbyshire, but particularly the north and into the Peak District. And the saxifrage family, they're perennial herbs. They usually have lobed leaves, but sometimes they can be a little bit fine, sort of mossy-like, in the case of mossy saxifrage. And they have two stigmas. So if you're looking at the flower, you're looking for two stigmas, 5 sepals, 5 petals, and 10 stamens. The flower itself often has this kind of slightly elongate, so the petals are kind of arched upwards. They're not sitting flat like some of the stitchworts would be almost a flat flower, but these are actually forming almost a kind of bell-like shape, a bit reminiscent of a bellflower, but this is fairly characteristic, and they can grow in these kind of dense patches as seen here, or they might just be growing singly across a field. So that's the meadow saxifrage. And another plant which is slightly different type of saxifrage, and there's 2 of these. The one that you're seeing a picture of is alternate leaf golden saxifrage, which has 4 sepals, no petals. So it's a slightly different arrangement, and there's only 8 stamens. Tends to have this kind of green foliage with the golden yellow flowers across the surface that you can see. It forms dense mats along the edges of streams, particularly in older woodlands, the ancient woodlands particularly. But you might find it more open situations as well. And there's opposite leaved golden saxifrage and alternate leaved. And that's mainly to do with, I think, if you can see that little leaf coming off there, that's just a single leaf. And there's another one which is obscured by this bigger leaf. There's another one down here. So this is alternate leaf golden saxifrage. If it was opposite, which is more common, much more abundant and widespread, there would be another opposite leaf here, which would be exactly the same as this one, but it would be coming off here. They are a little bit different in their form and habit. This is a bit bigger, leaves are a little bit bigger, but the 2 of them, they look very similar. So have a look for those long streams, marshes at the moment. Earlier on, we were having a quick chat about brown roofs, and one of the species that you might find on a brown roof is the stone crops. So here we've got biting stone crop, which is yellow flowers. The flowers are always kind of quite star-shaped. They can be single flowers at the top of the stem. The leaves tend to be a bit succulent-like, so reasonably, yeah, most of the time they can be flattened like this and have a slight succulent look, or they might be more spaced apart. So this white stone crop that you can see down here to the right, the flowers are in more of a sort of flower head, they're collected together, and the leaves are a little bit more spaced out, so you can see the stem there, whereas here the leaves are all flattened against each other. But stone crops are relatively widespread. They grow on rocks, so white stone crop grows on limestone rocks, particularly biting stone crop. You might find it in limestone areas or elsewhere. It often crops up in waste ground as well. Now, the pea family is a very large family of plants. The main characteristic, well, there's two things really. The flowers themselves have a particular shape and form, which you can see here in this diagram. They'll often have a standard petal in the center with wing petals and a keel petal. And then this, again, from a different angle, you can see here the wing petal, standard petal in the middle. And then this is actually showing a bud and the calyx of the flower down the bottom here. So peas, they all tend to have this kind of form. They can be born as quite dense flower heads, so lots of flowers clustered together, which you can see here with the lucerne, or there might be just a smaller number of flowers which are in 3s, 4s, 5s, which you can see here with common bird's foot trefoil. The leaves as well tend to be often be in groups of 3, so often trifoliate, but not always. So vetches will be kind of opposite leaves, so there can be some variability there. Some of the vetches have tendrils as well, so you might see them climbing through the vegetation. Meadow vetchling, another one that tends to climb through vegetation. So those are two of the peas, common bird's foot trefoil and lucerne. This is a smaller member of the pea family called black medic, which grows again in grasslands, open pastures, waste ground, brownfield sites, anywhere where it's quite open, and it can manage to find a gap in the usually with some bare ground. It prefers that, and you can see just about, hopefully, if you look at the tip of this leaf where I've got the cursor there is a very tiny little projection. It's like a little tiny tip on the end of the leaf. And that's characteristic of black medic and separates it from a very similar plant called lesser trefoil. The other way to identify this particular pea, member of the pea family, is to look at the seeds. But obviously you have to wait a little bit longer for the seeds to be produced and to start forming. So this produces kind of little, almost tablet-like seeds that are clustered together, whereas the lesser trefoil produces more of a pod. So there's quite a lot of variability in how legumes produce their seeds and whether they're in a pod, like a characteristic pea, or whether they form some other kind of structure. Often very distinctive. So yeah, black medic, if later in the season, you'd see these little clusters of black, say little black sort of seeds clustered together that almost look like little tablets. So that's black medic. And a bigger plant, which you find in acid grasslands, is bitter vetch. And it tends to flower from the bottom upwards. So you can see it's already flowered and set seed. So there are pods developing on at least 3 of these flowers, and probably that one as well at the back. And then at the top, you've got one flower here that's in flower, and then you've got another one which is still in bud. So quite a few peas tend to do that. They'll sort of flower upwards. The bitter vetch, slightly bigger plant than the bird's foot trefoil, a bit more upright. Obviously, it's got mauve flowers, and the leaves are opposite. So there's 2 pairs of opposite leaves, which are often at this kind of 45-degree angle on the stem, pointing upwards. So as I say, you'd expect to see this in grassland habitats, usually more acid grassland, but you might find it in daleside situations as well, particularly at the top of the dales where there's been a bit of leaching, and it tends to be a little bit more acidity at the top of some of the limestone dales. So it's quite a widespread plant, and it's definitely one that you might see in, say, road verges, for example. And another common member of the pea family is kidney vetch, which has got this, well, it's got beautiful clusters of yellow flowers, and they tend to be very hairy. So they've got this kind of woolly white appearance here. And you get lots and lots of flower heads all clustered together, often over quite a large area. And again, you might find this in limestone pastures, dales, or sometimes across sort of some of the waste sites, old limestone quarries, some brownfield sites as well. It's colonized, and it often does very, very well in those situations. But it's relatively common plant in some parts of Derbyshire. So again, worth keeping an eye out for that one. The carrot family, now this is another huge family of plants. So I'm just going to show a few examples of plants which you might see at the moment. So the first one here is cow parsley. If you're driving around anywhere at the moment, you'll have seen cow parsley. It is the most common umbellifer across the county, and it grows prolifically in road verges, waysides, the edges of woodland, edges of grasslands. Tends to be quite a big plant, quite tall. The leaves are quite feathery looking, quite finely divided, and they reach up into these white umbels of flowers. There's a close-up here, so you can see each of these is kind of a sort of individual umbel within the flower head, and the petals are different sizes. And you've got one petal here on the outside which is much bigger than all the rest, and that's characteristic of quite a few members of the carrot family. You'll see that repeated in other species, but quite fine, lacy kind of plant, cow parsley. It is replaced a bit later in the season by something called upright hedge parsley, which is very similar, just flowers a bit later, and it's a smaller plant, and there are some differences in leaf shape and the flowers. But at the moment, most of what you'll see is cow parsley. Now, just coming into flower in many places is hogweed. Big, tall umbellifer. Sometimes people mix them up with cow parsley, but it's a much stronger, more robust plant, much bigger leaves. It's very bristly and hairy. And you can see some of the flowers here. So they're bigger flowers that form a kind of ring around the center of the umbel here in the middle. And this is just a comparison of the cow parsley here on the left and the hogweed on the right. So you can just see how much of a difference there is in terms of the individual flowers. Hogweed, much bigger flowers, and this large flower here is dissected as well, so you can see it's kind of cut down the middle there. These are the cow parsley flowers, much smaller. And you may also be seeing some smaller umbellifers coming up in some of the pastures and in woodlands as well. The pignut is a plant that can survive in semi-shade and in open situations. It grows from a small kind of corm or bulb, which gives it its name, pignut. I've never seen a pig dig it up, but I think it probably happens. If you let the pigs out, that's probably what they do. There's one in France called great pignut, which is, as its name suggests, a bit bigger, and that is quite tasty. You can dig those up and eat them. They're very nice. Obviously, you can't do that here unless you get permission from the landowner. So this is pignut, and it has these fine leaves, which you can see on the right. So you're looking for very finely divided leaves. I don't know whether you can just about, as you go up the stem, the leaves become even more linear and finely divided. So it's probably about maybe a foot, maybe it gets up to about a foot tall in meadows, and you'll see it at the moment. It's the food plant for the chimney sweeper moth. There's a bit of sort of ecological interaction that you might want to store away somewhere. Chimney sweeper moths, which are actually they're not rare, but they have declined a bit. So it's always worth looking out for them. Now this one you want to steer well clear of if you know you're in any way likely to eat any of these plants. This is hemlock water dropwort, which is poisonous. There have been cases of people mistaking this for an edible plant. It has happened, which is not good at all because it's extremely poisonous. So you've got to be careful. And there are in the carrot family, there are a few poisonous plants. So it is worth checking the books, just making sure. Hemlock grows along a lot of our rivers, Trent Valley, Derwent Valley, and that's another poisonous plant. So you do have to be a bit careful. But this hemlock water dropwort grows in ditches and river edges. It's got these slightly bigger, glossy leaves, but essentially very similar umbels, white flowers. So it's one where you really have to get the books out and key them out and have a look at them. There's a number of these water dropworts, and in Derbyshire I think we've got 2 or 3 species, but hemlock water dropwort is the most common one. And another species which is a little bit more a slightly more benign plant, I suppose, in many ways, but this is sweet Sicily, which grows particularly in the Peak District and White Peak. You see it along roadsides and tracks and waysides. It's in flower at the moment, very leafy, big lacy leaves. You might get this confused with cow parsley, but this one smells very strongly of aniseed. So if you kind of sniff the leaves, you gently crush a leaf, being very careful, and sniff it. If it smells of aniseed, you've got sweet Sicily. So always worth checking that. They tend to be a little bit shorter as well. They don't get the same height that cow parsley gets, or hogweed gets for that matter. But essentially another white umbellifer to look out for. Roses. Typical rose would be something like the rose here, which is the Burnet rose, and then on the right we've got stone bramble. I picked stone bramble. It's a little bit. It's a bramble. It's very closely related to the normal bramble, but it only occurs in the White Peak in the Dales. It's kind of a rare. It's a rare bramble. It's quite a nice plant. It has these odd flowers which sit in the middle of the leaves and have this strange appearance where the petals are kind of almost just vertical rather than flat like a normal bramble. And then this one, as I say, Burnet rose. But you might see very characteristic is dog rose, which is a very thorny rose species which you find in hedgerows and hedgebanks and woodlands. Very common. So they can be trees and shrubs, they can be herbs, tend to have alternate leaves. Leaves can be lobed or divided. They don't have any stipules, and the flowers mostly have parts in 5s, but the cinquefoils, which I'll come on to in a minute, they can have 4 petals, and ladies' mantles are a bit different as well. So there are always exceptions to some of these rules. Number of stamens is 2, 3, or 4 times the number of sepals. So there's some relationships there which can be helpful when you're trying to identify some of these. So these are cinquefoils potentillas, and the one on the right here, tormentil, very common in acid grasslands and heathlands. characterized by 4 petals. There's at least one other similar species which might also have 4 petals, and it can be a hybrid, or it might be something called trailing tormentor, which is the picture here on the left. The difference is trailing tormentor tends to have flowers that have 5 petals, and then it will have a few flowers that only have 4. So you have to look at lots of flowers and see, do they all have 5 petals, or do some have 5 and some have 4? It tends to be trailing in its habit, and the leaves of trailing tormentor are in 3s, so they're trifoliate, which I think you can just about see here. There's just the 3 leaves, and again here 3 leaves. Whereas with tormentor tends to be 5. Not always, it will vary, but often the leaves will be divided up, and you can clearly see 5 separate kind of leaflets to the leaf. Slightly different in colour as well. Tormentor is probably a slightly more pale yellow than the trailing tormentor. And then there's creeping cinquefoil, which is very similar to this, but would have 5 leaves, not 3. So with these species, you're looking at the petals, the flowers, but you're also looking at the leaves and seeing whether it's trifoliate or whether it's got the 5 leaves. And 2 other similar species, which you might not automatically put in the rose family. These are Philopendulars. And on the left, we have meadowsweet, which is a very common plant growing in many situations, usually damp grasslands, marshes, fens, and then dropwort on the right here, which has got bigger flowers, but is quite very closely related to the meadowsweet. Dropwort tends to grow in limestone grassland, so it's a bit restricted in its distribution. It's a smaller plant, and it's 5 petals, fairly recognizable as a rose. Lots and lots of stamens here as well, so it's got this slightly untidy look to it here. The meadowsweet is much more sort of clustered, smaller flowers. It's kind of got this flossy look to it, so it sometimes just looks like a big mass of white blossom. When it usually grows in big stands, lots and lots of meadowsweet plants growing together, so you get that kind of white blossom growing across an entire stand of vegetation. And water avens, again, this is a geum, a slightly different member of the family. Tends to be in woodland habitats. It has these drooping flowers, which are, you can see the flowers kind of enclosed, and then you've got these sort of pinkish peach-like flowers, which you can see this hoverfly is trying to get some nectar from. You probably wouldn't, well, if you see water avens like this and it's fully grown, this is very characteristic. So this sort of habit, the look of it with the flowers drooping over and hanging down is very, very typical, almost kind of reminiscent of a fritillary. So you probably wouldn't mistake that. It might have yellow flowers, in which case it could easily be a hybrid with the much more common wood avens, which is similar plant but has smaller yellow flowers, which tend to be upright and would be sort of facing upwards rather than drooping downwards. And the wood avens can be a real pest in your garden. It grows really very, very prolifically in all sorts of situations and seeds very easily. The daisy family, again, another very large family. The flowers are in dense terminal heads. they're composites of many small flowers in a disc-like head. So there's lots and lots of small flowers growing in the center there. This is oxeye daisy, which is coming into flower at the moment, starting to see a lot of oxeye daisies in grasslands, verges, and other places. Lots of these yellow plants that you see mainly through sort of late spring and through the summer. So you might see dandelions, obviously more of a spring plant, amazing plants for invertebrates and insects, pollinating insects, love them, but they do get everywhere, and they're seeding all over the place at the moment. Very, very common member of the Asteraceae. And then this is on the left here, we've got goat's beard, which is sometimes called Jack goes to bed at noon, or Jack go to bed at noon. And at 12 o'clock, the flower closes. So if you arrive a bit late, this would just be closed up. You'd still see the edges of the flower, but you wouldn't see the whole thing. And it can be, the flower can sit within the sepals, so that it can be that these bracts or sepals elongate and extend beyond the flower. But equally, you might find that the flower is bigger than this, maybe twice the size, and actually sits right on top of all that, and you don't see the green kind of bracts underneath. So it's sort of two different forms. There's a couple of subspecies of goat's beard. But yeah, that's one that you might see. It forms a similar seed head to dandelion, but much bigger. It's probably about the size of a tennis ball, and quite a striking seed head. Architecturally, it's amazing to see just before it disperses. Probably meadows and pastures typically, and quite widespread across the county. And then two very similar plants are greater and common knapweed. Greater knapweed tends to have florets which are sort of drooping down or extended from the main flower, and the flower head itself is quite big. It's almost sort of almost got a slightly swollen look to it. Greater knapweed grows in limestone calcareous grasslands. You don't tend to find it in other habitats, whereas common knapweed, very, very widespread and common. You might see it growing in lots of different locations. Grasslands, neutral grasslands, edges of woodlands, woodland rides. Yeah, it's quite a widespread plant, but they are certainly superficially, at least, they're quite similar. The leaves are different as well. So greater knapweed has divided leaves, whereas common knapweed, the leaves might be a little bit wavy edged, but they don't tend to be divided. So that's another feature to look at is the leaves. But if you're seeing them in flower, you're looking for a denser flower head with common knapweed, and with greater knapweed, you'd be looking for these florets that are kind of extending outwards. Field scabious is in the teasel family, and these are opposite leaves, or the plants have opposite leaves, and the flowers are in dense heads on a kind of disc. There are a number of different scabious. Now, field scabious is quite a big, robust plant. You might see it growing on the edges of road verges. You might see it in meadows and pastures. It has this kind of pale mauve flower heads. The flowers are maybe 2 to 3 centimeters. So they're quite big flowers, and there's usually lots of them. If you get up close and you look at an individual flower, you will see that there are 4 parts to it, 4 petals. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So just bear that in mind, and we'll look at this one. This is small scabious, and it's superficially, it is quite similar, but it's a much smaller plant. It tends to grow in rocky limestone habitats or pastures, and there aren't as many flowers. So the flowers tend to be in more of a kind of a ring around the central disc. But also, if you look very closely, you can see that there are actually 5 parts to the flower. So there's a main petal here, which is the largest one, and then there's 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's divided into 5 separate parts. Whereas if you go back to the field scabious, the flower just has 4. So with the small scabious, the one at the back here is divided into 2. And you can just see that here. They're different, they look different once you get to know them. They are different plants, different sizes. The leaves of small scabious much more finely divided. Field scabious has bigger, more chunky leaves. So there are lots of differences, and you get to know those as you get to know the plants a bit better. And then the third one is the devil's bit scabious, which tends to have a darker colour, so it's a darker kind of bluey mauve, and it's a much smaller flowers, much more compact, with these kind of spikes, got a spiky kind of hedgehoggy type look to it, with these filaments and anthers sticking out there. So it's got a very different look to it. If they're all in flower, you can work them out quite easily. When you're just looking at the plant in leaf, it's a bit more tricky. The leaves of devil's bit scabious and common knapweed, and the small scabious, field scabious, at an early stage, you'd need to just check and see how finely divided they are, etc. But if they're in flower, they should be distinguishable by those features that I've just talked about. And we're just getting to the end of the spring season for, I suppose, the vernal element of our flora. So something like the wood sorrel, which is in its own family, the wood sorrel family. This is a plant of ancient woodlands and hedge banks. It's actually a plant that's declining across much of England. It's now listed as a near threatened plant in England, which is quite a surprise when I found that out. But it's just contracted in its range, and it's lost a lot of habitats, probably mostly hedgerows, where it's disappeared. But in Derbyshire, you might well find wood sorrel. In most parts of the county, I think it still grows, and it can be quite abundant in some woodlands, particularly where it's a bit damp and humid. And you're looking for these clover-like leaves, so trifoliate, 3 almost kind of heart-shaped leaves. And then the flower itself is this beautiful, very delicate 5 petals, just lined with these mauve veins. So very distinct flowers, and they grow singly on sort of solitary stems, but you might get lots of flowers coming out of a bank that's covered in wood sorrel. Probably still some in flower at the moment. So if you find a sheltered spot north facing, you probably find some wood sorrel still flowering, but it is getting to the end of the season. St John's worts. This is the Hypericacea. They are yellow flowered, 5 petals. We're looking at, there's 2 characteristic species here. Tutsan, which is this one, which is quite a big plant with the flowers all clustered at the top. Usually, I think here we can see maybe 4 or 5 flowers. Ancient woodland indicator species, so you're probably not going to find it away from ancient woodlands. It does get planted a bit though, so sometimes that can confuse things. But the Tutsan is quite a large plant. It has these big opposite leaves, which you can see here, and it can grow to a couple of, well, certainly a foot and a half tall. The plant here on the right is hairy St John's wort, which again tends to prefer base-rich soils, so often calcareous limestone type soils, but it will grow on alluvials and other places. Big tall plant, yellow flowers, 5 petals. The stem is softly hairy, so it's kind of downy, and the leaves are hairy. And the hairiness of this particular St John's wort distinguishes it from many of the others, which are either not hairy at all, or if they are, just very sparsely so. So this is a very downy plant. Perforate St John's wort is also very common, tends to be a little bit smaller than the hairy St John's wort. It doesn't have the hairy stems, and if you look at the leaves and hold them up against the light, you'll see that there are perforations in the leaf. So you just break off one of the leaves that are here, hold it up against the light, and see if you can see these tiny perforations. And that would be a good indicator that you're looking at perforate St John's wort. There is also an imperforate St John's wort. So if it hasn't got any perforations, you might well have that species. So it would put you on the right course to identification. You might need to just check. There are a couple of other species, and there is a hybrid, I'm afraid, which confuses matters. And then here on the right, there's something called slender St John's wort, which is smaller plant, tends to be quite wiry in its kind of habit, tends to grow in acid, heathy places, sometimes on the edges of woodlands, or it can grow in acid grasslands as well. So it's very similar. The flowers are all very, very similar. So you're really looking at the stems, the leaves, how hairy is it? Has it got perforations? Is the stem round or is it square? There is a square stalked St John's wort. There's one for every occasion really with these plants, and all of those things can be really useful. And they do all grow in slightly different habitats. So that's the other thing, is to look around when you're looking at these plants and think, well, where am I? What kind of place am I in? Is it dry? Is it damp? Is it shady? Is it bright and sunny? They all make a big difference to these plants. Violets, there are a lot of different violet species, and I'm not going to go through many of those, but just to show you mountain pansies, because they are a real feature in some parts of the limestone dales. You get carpets of mountain pansies. And you can see these are irregular flowers, so slightly different sized petals. You've got 5 sepals, 5 petals, the lowest lip petal with backwards directed spur. We can't quite see that on these, but there is, behind the flower, there is a spur that comes up from the larger petal. So this is mountain pansy. You might find it at places like Gang Mine near Wirksworth, probably getting to the end of the mountain pansy season. And then this is common dog violet. So you can see the spur here. So characteristic of a lot of violets is this sort of spur and the irregular flower shape again. There are a number of violets which all look quite similar. So you've got common dog violet, early dog violet, sweet violet. You want to be looking at the flowers, the colour of the flowers, whether they are fragrant or not fragrant. So common dog violet doesn't really smell of, you can't smell it, but sweet violet, if you've got a good nose, you can smell sweet violets. You do need to get down close to the flower though. And also these spurs have different features. So this one is notched at the end there. So there are a number of features that you've got to look at, but they're quite small features that you do need to get close with, often with a hand lens to check out. Geraniums, it won't be long before we start seeing meadow cranesbill this beautiful pale blue flower. We often see them on road verges these days. They're actually a plant of damp, wet meadows. And in some places you can still find them growing in those kind of grassy habitats, but often they are kind of surviving at the edges of our roads, along with lots of other plants like the oxeye daisies we saw earlier. The geraniums, they're just sort of starting to seed a bit here. That sometimes they'll have quite characteristic fruits and seeds that can be quite elongate in shape. But this is a large plant, big, round, divided leaves. You can see some of the leaves here coming off the stem, and large blue flowers with 5 petals. So pretty distinctive, unlikely to mistake it for anything else. This is a much smaller cranesbill. This is shining cranesbill, Geranium lucidum. And it occurs in gardens, on walls, in limestone grasslands, pastures, waste ground. And you can see it's got this kind of inflated sort of calyx here. So the seeds are developing inside here, and there's quite a long projection. So they've got quite a distinct look to them. And the flower itself, this sort of pink, still 5 petals, but much smaller. So from one sort of extreme to the other with meadow cranesbill and shining cranesbill, but they can be growing in similar places. The other thing to note with shining cranesbill, the leaves can turn very red. So it just depends what they're growing on. They'll sometimes be very green, or they might turn red quite quickly. So you can get this kind of sea of red in some locations. And then in the Peak District, you might find bloody cranesbill, which tends to have darker mauve to reddish sort of flowers. They don't photograph very well. They're one of those plants where the camera struggles to get the right color. I mean, I guess these days with a lot of cameras, you can probably correct that. But I don't think the color's quite right on this photograph. So it's worth bearing that in mind. And then the leaves tend to be more finely divided than meadow cranesbill. But the flowers, not quite as big as meadow, but a little bit smaller. And it's much more associated with and restricted to limestone, calcareous grasslands, dale sides. So you don't find this plant away from the White Peak area in Derbyshire. Or at least maybe 1 or 2 places, but most of the time not so. And another very beautiful plant that you might well find growing in grasslands is milkwort. This is common milkwort. Usually it's got this beautiful sort of blue flowers. Occasionally there could be white or pink, so it's a bit variable. There is a heath milkwort, which is very similar, and you have to look at the base leaves to distinguish them. The habitat might tell you a little bit. So if you are in a very heathy, acid grassland type place, then you would want to check to see, well, is it definitely heath milkwort or is it common milkwort? And you do need to check the lower leaves to see whether they are opposite or alternate. Not easy. I've struggled on this many times. Maybe once you get your eye in, you might be able to sort of tell the difference, but I've always found them quite tricky. Common milkwort is, as I say, is the more common one. And the key thing that you'll see is that the flowers are in these terminal racemes or spikes, and there's 5 free sepals and 3 fused petals. It's got an unusual flower arrangement. And then the lower petal is dissected into this fringe of lobes, which you can see here and over here. So it's got this kind of frilly look to it, and there's nothing else really looks like that. But you do have to look quite closely because they're quite low growing, woody, sort of shrubby type plants. And it might well be that you'd find common rock rose growing with milkworts. This is another woody plant. It's evergreen, 5 sepals, 5 petals. Usually the common rock rose that we have is yellow flowers. There is a white one, but it's not, you don't find it in Derbyshire, but you might find it elsewhere in the country. But yeah, so common rock rose can be very abundant on some limestone calcareous grasslands, particularly in the Peak District. And it's definitely worth looking out for a bit later in the season. It won't be in flower quite yet, probably a few more weeks before that comes into flower. Cabbages, another very large family. They are characterized by having 4 petals. So it's a key thing to look for is how many petals, and if it's got 4 and they are in these kind of, tend to be in a kind of raceme or a spike, or a number of flowers that come off the stem of the plant. But wherever you see those sort of 4 petals, you might well be thinking, well, is this some kind of brassicaceae cabbage type thing? This is cuckoo flower that we're looking at here, Cardamine pratensis, which has been flowering over the last 6 weeks probably. You can still find it flowering at the moment. Damp grasslands and edges of woodlands, anywhere where the ground is a little bit damper and not too dry. It can survive in grasslands which have been agriculturally improved to some extent, so it can still be quite a widespread thing. But it does best in slightly marshy, damp grassland habitats. And it's the food plant for orange tip butterflies. And then very closely related to it is the large bittercress, Cardamine amara, which is another plant which likes watersides and marshes, but it has white flowers, and the anthers are purple. So you might occasionally get them confused, because occasionally cuckoo flower can be very pale, and they might grow together. But generally speaking, large bittercress is bigger, and it does tend to have its feet in either actually in the water or where it's much marshier, whereas cuckoo flower is a little bit more edges of the marsh, sort of. But it's a matter of degree to some extent. And another plant you will be seeing a lot of this. It grows pretty much everywhere. It's garlic mustard. If you crush a leaf, it smells of mustard. The flowers are in clustered heads. They are 4 petals, as you can see, so characteristic there of the cabbages. And yeah, quite a tall plant, quite leafy, these big sort of round pointy leaves. And it's, yeah, very, very common, growing in lots of places. And it's another plant which is used by a number of butterflies and moths, but the orange tip butterfly uses this plant as well as the cuckoo flower. Now we're reaching 8 o'clock. So I think we were going to try and sort of wrap up roughly around 8, but I'm happy to carry on for a few more minutes and just talk about the campions, and then perhaps we can stop and deal with any questions, discussion.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. We've got no questions so far, but everyone's obviously just listening carefully.
Yeah, I mean, if anyone needs to go, obviously, thank you very much, but look out for the PDF version of this, which you'll be sending out when you, but I'll go through just a few more, because I mean, there are so many of these plants, and you know, there are lots of families that I've not spoken about at all. So it's really just kind of a taster of what's out there. And I think with the campions, it does include a couple of nice plants which are flowering at the moment, like this one, which is greater stitchwork. And you may well see this growing locally, hedge banks and woodlands. It's probably one of the most common members of the campion family. Leaves are in opposite pairs, and the flowers are in these what are called forked chimes. There's petals and sepals are usually 5, sometimes 4. And often with the stitchworts, you will see that the petals are notched. So you've actually got, it looks a little bit like there's twice as many petals as there are here. So there's actually, this is a notch. So that's one petal, and the notch is about maybe a third of the way down. Quite a large flower, again forming this almost a kind of sort of flask-like shape. Maybe about 30 centimeters can be, they might get up to about 30 centimeters in height. Now a bit later on, but maybe they probably are just starting to come out, but lesser stitchwork. Occasionally you will find them growing in the same place. I have seen them growing side by side. But lesser stitchwork tend to prefer grasslands rather than woodlands. And it's a smaller plant. Flowers are smaller, but they're also much more divided. So you can see on this one, the petal is divided almost right the way down to the base. So that's quite a key feature to separate it. If you were wondering, is it greater or lesser stitchwork? Have a look at the petals and how deeply cut they are. And then a couple of characteristic members as well. Ragged robin, very distinctive, dissected leaves, almost got this kind of man, looks a little bit like, I mean, if it was an orchid, they'd have called it like something like, I mean, would have been called man orchid or something, would it pink man orchid or something. But it's got this lovely wavy petals which are finely cut and divided. Ragged robin grows in marshy grasslands, fens, places like that. And it is another plant that has declined. So it's also on this near threatened in England list, which is extraordinary, really. I mean, it shouldn't be the case at all, but it just shows how much land has been drained and how many marshes have disappeared. And it's not that common in Derbyshire. You know, every so often you find somewhere and there's lots and lots of ragged robin, but it can be a bit hard to find sometimes. The red campion here on the right is much more common. Like, this grows everywhere, and it's in hedge banks and woodlands and ancient woodlands, secondary woodlands, lots of different habitat types. But it is a very welcome sight in the spring. It's got these beautiful, large, pinky mauve flowers. So looking a little bit sort of stitchworty with the notches there, but it's a flatter flower than greater stitchwork. The campions tend to be a little bit more flat in shape. And the final one I'll end on for this evening, spring sandwort. This is sometimes called leadwort. It's associated with lead spoil heaps. So it grows mostly in the White Peak area. And it's a low growing sort of cushion forming member of the campion family. You can see 5 petals. These petals are not notched at all. So some of the members of this family have entire petals, and some of them there will be divided. So it's worth just bearing that in mind. So the sandworts tend to have 5 petals, tend to be white, not, I think they're all white, but most of the ones I've been looking at recently tend to be white flowers, often quite small, so time-leaved, which I think, do I have a picture of time? Yeah, so that's another sandwort, time-leaved sandwort, very small flowers. That grows in sandy ground, but it's still the same family as the spring sandwort that we can see here. But you will find spring sandwort growing at Gangmine and in other places across the White Peak. Wherever there are old lead spoil mines, you might find cushions of spring sandwort. And it flowers for quite a long time, so you might see it in June or right into July as well. You might still find some of them flowering. I will stop there, and if there are any thoughts, questions, comments, I'm happy to have a bit of a chat.
We've got one question in the chat from Dave. It says, what are cymes?
Well, it's the arrangement of the flower head. So there are lots of different forms that they can take, and it's one of those things that's easiest to describe it with a picture, but I haven't got a picture handy, I don't think. But it's kind of almost like small kind of umbels in a way. So there's like a fork, and then there'll be a cluster of flowers on the end of that. If that makes sense.
Does that make sense, Dave?
If I could find a picture of a chime, I would show it in my. I did have one earlier, but I don't think I've got them. No, I can't see it. But yes, there's the sort of flower shape is they're described and categorized. So you'll get people talking about panicles and a raceme of flowers, which is kind of a spike, or it might be an umbel of flowers, as in the umbellifers. I think the sort of chimes is more where you've got flowers coming off at angles, and then you've got a cluster of flowers on the end of each fork.
Dave says he understands. He says, yes, if like hogweed.
Yeah, a little bit like that, although hogweed is more of an umbel. So there we arrive at what's the difference between a chime and an umbel? which we might need pictures for. But yes, but that sort of terminology, it is good to try and remind yourself of it, because a lot of the time you kind of just look at the flowers and skipping to the glossary and seeing, well, what do all these terms mean is always a useful task for all of us to try and remember to do that.
He says he'll look it up. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think I can't see who this one came from, actually. It says, I'm creating a small area of woodland and wildflower meadow in my garden. Where can I obtain seeds of plants that are native to my specific area? I know I've just bought some from Wildscapes for the kids to make seed balls with, but I don't know how specific you want to be on area.
Yeah, in Derbyshire, it is quite difficult finding local provenance seed. We haven't got a plant nursery that's growing seed from local plants, as far as I know. There might be a few individual people doing it, and there have been a few targeted projects for some plants, but we haven't kind of got a go-to plant nursery, which has been a bit of a problem over the years. So we've tended to, if we are buying in seed, we always try and make sure it is British native seed. And then we've tended to try and go to people who are reasonably local. So Naturescape.
They're sort of Nottingham based, aren't they?
They're Nottingham. And a lot of the sort of developers, the big housing companies, they often use Emmersgate. But there are others. It's tricky. The closer you can get them, the better, and have a conversation with the people you're buying from, and try and keep it simple. So don't introduce anything that's kind of obviously out of its geographical range. If it's a native plant, probably best not to introduce it if you can avoid that. But yeah, it's something we've talked about. It'd be great to have a local nursery where you're growing plants on, but we haven't got that at the moment.
Fabulous. Patrick asks, are there any native wildflowers that could be grown or encouraged to grow in your own garden? Any recommendations?
Yes, I mean, you can, with perseverance, you can get a lot of these plants to grow. Sometimes it takes a while for them to appear. So you've got to have a look and see, first of all, what sort of soil have you got? What's the kind of light shade situation? So if, for example, you've got an open grassland lawn meadow type situation, you can introduce quite a lot of the plants I've talked about. You might be able to get them growing. You might be able to just buy a seed mix with things like oxeye daisy, common knapweed, common birdsfoot trefoil, bush vetch, meadow vetchling. They'll all grow. Sometimes they grow very quickly and can become a little bit of a pest. So you have to be a little bit careful about that. But yeah, lots of meadow plants will do okay. So typical ones that you would see on a species list that are sold by these nurseries, they often do okay. You need to prepare the ground. So if you're putting seed in, make sure it's a really good seed bed. If you use plug plants, that can be effective. So buy in plug plants in spring, get them out after the frosts if you can, and make sure you water them. If you go through a dry, we've had a really dry April, so if you put in plug plants in the beginning of April, they might have struggled because of the dry conditions. So you just got to think about how much time you can spend creating it. And then you can put in bluebell bulbs, you can put in wood anemone bulbs, wild garlic. If you've got shady areas, they'll all grow. It might take a while. The greatest stitchwork, that grows quite well if you've got a shady area of the grass of the garden along the edge or sort of dappled shade. They grow, pretty well. I've got them growing in my garden, and yeah, they're spreading quite nicely. So yeah, there's quite a range of things will grow if you give them the right conditions and look after them.
I know on that, with the plug plants and that, I know we did a webinar some time ago with Dave Goulson, and of course he was recommending shopping carefully and buying those sorts of plants from an organic grower, because a lot of regular nurseries can have pesticides in them, can't they?
Yeah, and it's very tricky. I mean, I think if you ring up Naturescape or one of these other nurseries and you talk to them and you find out, have they used any? I mean, I wouldn't have thought Naturescape would use.
No, I think they're all okay. I know I was buying some plug plants for the junior rangers to do a bee garden some time ago, and it was quite easy to find organic providers, but it's just taking that look and being aware that the garden centres and places don't always have that in mind. They might have a label on it saying bee friendly.
No.
It's not necessarily.
Yeah. And another part, it just reminded me, if you're creating a meadow, if you can, put in some yellow rattle, because it will, once the yellow rattle becomes established, it helps to keep the grasses down. So it can open up the vegetation and allows the other plants to find a bit more room and grow in a meadow situation. Yellow rattle doesn't grow everywhere, so it won't like acid soils, but it will grow in neutral or calcareous ground. And yeah, once you get yellow rattle going, it can really help. And it means you don't have to cut the lawn, which it doesn't become, it stops being a lawn and becomes a meadow, and you don't have to cut it until end of August. So you just enjoy it.
Right, just put another question on. She says, is it true you mustn't plant the Spanish bluebells in your garden?
Yeah, well, I did read somewhere that the concern over hybridization wasn't as bad as we had initially feared. So there was a lot of worry that Spanish bluebells and English bluebells were hybridizing, and that would result in losing the fertility of English bluebell populations in woodlands. Now, there was this study done, and their results seem to suggest that that hybridization actually wasn't happening very much and wasn't as big a threat as people had thought. That said, if you're going to put bluebells in, you can get the English bluebell to grow if you've got nice sort of dappled shade is probably best, and it's not, again, not too acidic. But in Derbyshire, bluebells grow out in the open, so you can get them to grow. But you put the bulbs in, you might have to wait a while. So it could be a couple of years before they come up. That's what happened with me. And you think, oh, it's that was a waste of money. And then 2 years later, bluebell pops up. So
be patient. It'll help.
Yes, yeah. It's the same with wood anemone. You can plant wood anemone, and you get these tiny little corms, and you think, well, I don't even know which way up to plant it. And you stick it in the ground, and then you forget about it, and 3 years later, wood anemones come up. So it's, sometimes you have to wait. But Spanish bluebells, I mean, I've got some in my garden. I probably shouldn't say that. And I was going to rip them all out until I read that report, and then I thought, well, maybe it's okay. I'm not near any ancient woodland. If I was next to an ancient woodland, I think I would have pulled them out.
Fabulous. I think that's it for questions. So last calls for any more questions. I think we're all good, Kieran. Thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you very much.
For having a second go at it.
Yeah, no, that's...
and Dana said, I've found this presentation so useful because it's brought keys to life in an interesting visual way. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, there will be a day at Carsington. Can't remember whether we've got a date for it.
We have. Let me check.
I've got a date.
Off the top of my head, it was the 28th of June, but I'll just quickly check. It is, yes, the 28th of June.
28th of June. So we're going to be visiting some habitats that are around the edge of Carsington Reservoir. 28th of June. And that obviously seeing the plants in the flesh, so to speak. It's not really in the what would it be? Yeah, in the organic matter of the green plant. But it's the 3D. I mean, it's really difficult on Zoom with pictures. There are two. It's a flat screen that you're looking at, and it's the scale. So I worry that you see a picture of a plant and it looks the wrong size. So the only way to actually see how big a plant really is to go out and look at it in all its glory in its habitat, and then you can walk around it and you can poke it and look at it under a ×10 lens. So get out and look at as many plants.
The information for this webinar, there was the information in there as well about how to book onto that Carsington trip if you want to. So I think it's my email address that's in there. Just email me and I will book you on. We still have places left on it. That's it. Thank you very much, Kieran.
Brilliant. Jolly good. Thank you very much. Okay.
And we will send a link to the recording and a PDF version of Kieran's slides round as soon as it's all ready.
Yeah.
I can see it's still recording this time, so hopefully the cloud is not full and we have an entire session recorded instead of 1 minute of it.
Great. All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye night.